Hey, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our fifth Environmental Justice Rulemaking Stakeholder meeting. For those of you I haven't had the pleasure of meeting before, I am Olivia Glenn, the Deputy Commissioner for Environmental Justice and Equity at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. We are convened this evening to focus on stakeholder discussion on one specific aspect of the environmental justice law for rulemaking, namely environmental justice impact statements. This is building on a platform of the passage of the environmental justice law on September 18th of 2020. The law does not go into effect until we adopt rules, and today's discussion is a continuation of the process that gets us to rule completion. If you missed any of the past meetings, you can find that information on our Office of Environmental Justice website at nj.gov/DEP/EJ. And since we have just begun, I wanted to note to everyone that this meeting is being recorded. And by joining this evening's meeting, you are giving consent for this meeting to be recorded. Next slide, please. Please note that closed captioning is available on the Microsoft Teams platform. You can access it by clicking on the ellipsis, and then multiple options will appear in a drop-down menu. Locate and click on Turn on Live Captions, and then you will see live captions begin at the bottom of the Teams window. Next slide, please. Our agenda for today is as follows. We will continue introductory matters here, and we'll also discuss rules for engagement. We will discuss a potential process, as well as the statutory minimum timeline. We'll discuss potential elements of an environmental justice impact statement, and we'll pose some questions to you for other considerations as we advance how we'll proceed with environmental justice impact statements. And as we usually do, we'll make sure we provide a good amount of time at the end to focus on Q&A. For next steps, our next stakeholder meeting will take place the week of June 21st. And at that point in time, we will go back and we'll have an opportunity to review all the other topics we've discussed before we get into our formal rule writing process. Tonight's presentation, the meeting recording, and a follow-up survey will be emailed to all participants and also posted on the OEJ website shortly after the meeting. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are our rules of engagement for this evening. If you can please remain on mute unless you are speaking. Since we are recording and we're all trying to do active listening, it increases our ability to listen and engage, and it also increases the caliber of our recording. When you want to speak during the facilitated discussion, please use the raise hand function. Across the ribbon at the top, you will see a smiling emoji with a hand like this. And if you click on that emoji, you'll see a drop-down menu appear. And where you see just the hand, that is how you raise your hand. You click on that hand. Next, we will ask that you treat everyone with respect, that you limit your comment or question to the topic being discussed, and that you limit your comments to 2 minutes. You will see me physically raise my hand like this as you approach 90 seconds. And I will also add, just for attendees who may not know who the speaker is, if you could not just identify your name, but also if you happen to have an organization affiliation, or if you are just a member of the public who is here, if you could just note that for us after we call your name to speak on the record. And again, I just want to note that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the DEP website after the session concludes. The next slide, please. Okay, so now at this time, I am happy to pass you over to my esteemed colleague, Sean Moriarty, who is our Chief Advisor for Regulatory Affairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner Glenn, and thank you all for joining us. Again, this evening, we are nearing the end of our stakeholdering journey, and we are all really deeply grateful for your continued engagement and your continued willingness to join us on these Thursday nights. The feedback that we've gotten so far has really made the direction that this rule is heading, I think, much stronger, and I'm hopeful that that feedback and our reactions to that feedback will be reflected in some of the things we talk about today already. So we think it's pretty decent, framing device to talk about the potential process and how the different pieces that we've talked about so far fit in particular the piece we're going to talk about today, which is what you see on your screen as step 2, the environmental justice impact statement process, at least that's what we're calling it. So I'm going to walk you through what has become a 3-step process from a 4-step process. Last time I think there was, I think frankly I didn't do the best job in terms of explaining what we were talking about, so we took some of that feedback and have tried to put it in a little bit clearer and a little bit better terms. I'm going to walk through that before we get into some of the meat of the presentation and some of the questions that we'd like to solicit feedback on. Obviously, if at any point, for any reason, anyone wants to jump in and ask a question, please just raise your hand. That's what we're here for. We're here for the back and forth, and you're most certainly not here just to listen to me speak. So step 1, and this is similar to what we talked about last time, I believe. That's the step we're just calling the initial screen. That's where using the publicly available data that we have on our mapping tool, which includes both the demographic criteria for the overburdened communities, as well as the stressor layers that we will add as we are able to move forward with the data work on those. An applicant, a member of the community, will be able to determine whether an overburdened community is subject to adverse environmental and public health stressor levels that are higher than the appropriate geographic point of comparison. Again, that touches back on, I think, the first stakeholder session we had, where we talked about what that appropriate geographic point of comparison would be. Law says state, county, or other geographic unit as determined by the department. Certainly something we're still looking at and will be in a position to speak more about at our late June button-up stakeholder meeting. Step 2, again, what we'll talk about today in a bit more detail, is the environmental justice impact statement process. That part of the process calls for the development of an environmental justice impact statement, which includes public comment period, as well as a hearing in the overburdened community where the applicant assesses whether and how the proposed facility will cause or contribute to adverse stressor levels in the overburdened community that are higher than the appropriate geographic point of comparison. Again, kind of hearkening back to step 1. If they are, the applicant would need to propose measures to avoid or eliminate those impacts. And if it cannot avoid or eliminate those impacts, cannot avoid causing or contributing to those higher stressor levels, then what we're calling a disproportionate impact is present, which then kicks you into additional parts of this analysis. We can go to the next slide. So now we've combined what was previously steps 3 and 4 into one step, which is really, frankly, more clear. We appreciate the feedback on that. What we're calling now departmental review. So that's the part where the department gets involved in looking at the environmental justice impact statement and considering the proposed project in the context of our permitting. So where a disproportionate impact is present for new facilities, that results in a denial unless there is a demonstrated compelling public interest in the overburdened community. As it says on the screen, the department shall deny the permit application for a new facility unless it is of the type that will serve a compelling public interest in the overburdened community where it's to be located. We've adjusted our focus here, and I think that's based on feedback, particularly in this version of the meeting last time, to be clear that when we're talking about compelling public interest, we're talking about very specific facility types and not talking about conditions or benefits to satisfy that compelling public interest standard. And we've certainly taken some feedback and are expecting additional written feedback on what types of facilities folks might think are appropriate for that, but we're really looking to tighten that definition in a way that people are comfortable with. If it is not a denial and it is a specific facility type that is appropriate for compelling public interest analysis, then the department would impose additional conditions on the construction operation of that facility to protect public health and ultimately improve baseline environmental and public health stressors in the overburdened community. We're attempting to make clear here that those conditions are subsequent to a finding of whether that facility, the specific facility in question, falls within that categorical definition that might be eligible for eligible for a compelling public interest. And then part B is permit conditions, and that's where we get into more specificity regarding facility expansions or permit renewals, Title V permit renewals, where the department imposes additional binding conditions concerning the construction, operation, and facility targeted towards the protection of public health. So again, that's our framing device. That's just to hopefully to give everyone some context as we move forward in talking about that step 2, which is the environmental justice impact statement process. So that takes us basically to a conversation about what are the minimum statutory timeframes set forth in the EJIS process, aimed at providing a little bit more background for folks. Now, we're calling this minimum because we think there are some places where we have to have a conversation. We have some questions teed up about how all of these things should work, but basically just want to lay out what the statute provides in terms of timing and in terms of reviews. So we're using kind of the day 0 approach, where day 0 is the day in which an environmental justice impact statement is completed and provided to the department for publication on its website, as well as, notice of a public hearing and public comment period is issued. So that's day 0. Prior to day 0, that is the time period in which an applicant would be preparing the environmental justice impact statement, and they would be doing so reviewing the publicly available data on the DEP mapping tool, as well as addressing the things we'll talk about later today in terms of what the specific components of an environmental justice impact statement should be. Again, day 0, that environmental justice impact statement would be distributed both to DEP for publication on the website and provided to the municipality. In issuing notice for a public hearing and public comment period, that notice is to be provided in 2 newspapers circulating within the overburden community, including one that is a non-English language newspaper, as well as a copy, again, placed on the DEP website, and notice of the application put in the department's bulletin with a copy to the municipality. In this instance, the notice, as called for by the legislation, sets forth the time, date, and location of the public hearing, description of the proposed project, provides mapping indicating the location of the facility, summary of the environmental justice impact statement, and how someone can go about obtaining a copy. We'll talk a little bit about that, how and where to submit written comments, and then kind of a catch-all, any other information deemed appropriate by the department, which gives us a little bit more flexibility in terms of how we might put together that type of notice in a regulation. That notice is to be issued at least 60 days prior to the public hearing. Again, a public hearing held in the overburden community. And that takes us to day 60. So day 60 on this timeline is the public hearing. At the public hearing, in accordance with the legislation, the applicant is required to provide a clear, accurate, and complete information about the proposed project, the potential environmental and public health stressors associated with that project, and accept written and oral comments from any interested party, and ultimately provide an opportunity for meaningful public participation at the public hearing. In that situation, the legislation calls for the municipality to be invited to the hearing. Post that hearing on day 70, 10 days thereafter, the applicant is required to provide a transcript of the hearing, including all the public comments received to the department. It's at this point where we talk about, this day 60 to day 70, where the department is first empowered under legislation to consider an application administratively complete, which is step 1 in the department's ultimate review process under our existing regulatory structure, where we'll be looking at the underlying permits. And that takes us to day 105. Now, day 105 is the date key to 45 days after the public hearing. Now, under the law, the department cannot issue any decision on any permit that is subject to the environmental justice impact statement process until 45 days after the public hearing. Again, for context, if we're not considering an application administratively complete until somewhere between day 60 and 70, day 45 may ultimately be earlier in the process than we would be prepared to issue a permit decision under any sort of normal course anyway, but that sets kind of the front end expectation of how long we must wait before we would take any action. I think practically those permit decisions often take significantly longer. In making any decision, the department considers the environmental justice impact statement and any other relevant information, including testimony and written comments received at the public hearing. So the department has rather broad discretion in terms of what it should look at, but the core of that record, the core of what the department is looking at in that situation is the environmental justice impact statement. And in my mind, very crucially, the information provided by the members of the community at that hearing. A couple of things just to note here. if there are multiple permits, so if it's a, particularly an instance of a new facility and they're seeking multiple permits, potentially a development permit as well as a Water Pollution Control Act permit or a solid waste permit or some of the other permits that are listed in the legislation as triggers, the bill states that for multiple permits, we will only be requiring this process once. Now that sets the baseline, but the bill also does give the department discretion to require additional hearings due to complexity of an application. So we have a bit of flexibility on that end. We would not be in a position to require multiple public hearings just because of the presence of multiple permits for one project. Really kind of a project is really what we'd be talking about in a public hearing, but if additional process is needed for reasons that the department thinks are appropriate, we can require additional hearings to be held by the applicant. Okay, moving on. So that's basically just that brief outline, and we're going to talk about some of those pieces, how we might fill in those statutory requirements with some more information. But first, we want to talk to you just a little bit about what should be included in an environmental justice impact statement very broadly. Here's, as we often do, we start with the statutory context. The statute provides that an environmental justice impact statement must assess the potential environmental and public health stressors associated with the proposed facility, as well as any adverse environmental or public health stressors that cannot be avoided if a permit is granted, as well as the environmental and public health stressors already borne by the overburdened community. So what we talk about here are kind of three major themes, which you can draw from there. First, what are the stressors borne by the overburdened community? Two, what are the potential stressors associated with that proposed facility? And three, what are the measures that a facility would take or propose to take to avoid the impacts from those stressors? So those are kind of your three major themes, which leads us into a bit of a list that we've come up with, just a preliminary list of requirements for environmental justice impact statement. This is going to be fairly high level because we do want to hear from folks if you have comments here. So we're going to walk through a little bit of that. I'll kind of walk through what those requirements could look like and ask for general feedback on that as we go through there. We can go to the next slide. So here's our preliminary list of requirements that draws largely from what we just talked about from statutory language, but kind of breaks it down into a few more steps or requirements. Generally speaking, as I'm going through this, you keep in the back of your mind some of the things we're looking to ask you, just really any general questions folks might have on what these elements are, what they might look like in process or in practice, I should say. Are there things that folks believe we are missing? And I will caveat that with that number 7. We're going to go into two specific examples of existing impact statements and talk a little bit about what those include. So that may be part of how we want to go about considering that. And really on this, are there any things that shouldn't be included here, or are there modifications folks would suggest to our approach? So let's just kind of walk through 1 through 6 in a bit of detail, and then we'll pause, and then we'll go to 7, which will give us a little bit more context here. So I think the first requirement is an analysis of the environmental or public health stressors already borne by the overburdened community as a result of existing conditions located in or affecting the overburdened community. So that is something that we expect to be able to be done with the publicly available data, where we're layering all of those stressors and creating tables that will allow folks to look at a particular block group, look at a particular address, and look at what those specific stressor levels are. How exactly that data will be shown, it might be shown kind of in percentiles or something. We're still kind of working on the details there, but you'll be able to make a comparison by clicking on that information, by using that data tool to be able to see whether that particular block group and those individual stressor levels are higher than the appropriate geographic point of comparison. Again, state, county, potentially the lower of the two. Those are some of the concepts we've rolled out already. Second is a determination of the environmental or public health stressors that are higher than a geographic point of comparison. I think I probably already talked about that. I've already kind of stepped on my own wording already, but basically taking that data, looking at kind of in table form and making that point of comparison. Number 3 is where a facility needs to consider its full operation and assess what additional stressors it might bring to the overburdened community. So if you're a new facility or an existing facility, you would be considering whether you're going to be contributing a point source of water pollution. Are you going to be contributing to noise? Are you going to be contributing to odors? Are by your operations going to be contributing to mobile or stationary sources of air emissions within a community? Are you going to be contributing stormwater to a CSO community? These are the types of things, these are the types of analysis that we would be expecting an applicant to go through facility-wide, piece by piece, to determine what those stressors are and what they're going to bring to the community. Once they've done that, once they've looked through their kind of operational conditions, they would be required at step 4 or requirement 4 to compare those to the stressor levels that are present in the current community. They would be asking themselves things like, am I contributing to a stressor that is already higher than the geographic point of comparison? Am I contributing to a stressor that is at present not higher, but would become higher by operation of my facility? Those are the types of questions we'd be looking for them to ask themselves and to analyze in accordance with that data. That takes to step 5. What avoidance measures can I put in place if I'm a facility to ensure that I'm not contributing to levels that are already higher, or that I'm not contributing to levels that are not higher that would then be higher by operation of my facility? What are those avoidance measures? How can I adjust my operations to avoid contributing to stressors that are higher in the given overburden community? And number 6, as we talked about last time, I think this is a really important element of an environmental justice impact statement. So if an applicant is seeking to site a new facility, and as part of that, they've made a determination they would like to try to meet the definition, the categorical definition of the compelling public interest, we would think that in an environmental justice impact statement, they need to outline the basis for that position, how that particular facility fits within the categorical definition of an appropriate facility, and then in addition to that, if they can pass that threshold piece, what conditions that facility would propose to avoid and or minimize their impacts and or otherwise improve baseline conditions in an OBC. Again, any of those additional conditions only coming if you're meeting the statutory or the regulatory definition of a facility that is eligible to be considered for a compelling public interest. So those are kind of like, hopefully not too basic, but kind of laying out how we think you walk through this process if you're a facility, and what individuals in communities would expect to see as part of an environmental justice impact statement. When we get to 7, we're going to talk about two existing examples and talk about some of the other things that would be included to provide more context, to provide more usability, and potentially provide a broader level of analysis to an environmental justice impact statement. But again, those are kind of the basics just in terms of looking at stressors. So this might be a good place to pause and just see if folks have any questions or comments or feedback they'd like to give us on this part so far. All right. Oh, we do have a hand. Great.
Okay, go ahead, Ray.
Okay,
Nichols?
thank you. On number 2, you mentioned a geographic point of comparison. And from previous discussions, you were talking about geographic areas of comparison. And depending upon the nature of the stressor and available data, the areas may be different depending upon the stressor. In some cases, it might be a county. In some cases, it might be the state. In some cases, it might be a municipality or a amalgamation of municipalities. And therefore, I think instead of using the word point, I would suggest the use of the word area. And actually, I would suggest areas, plural.
Thank you, Ray. We'll certainly take that into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Next is Renee Pollard. And Renee, if you could identify your organizational affiliation, if you have one first, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I am affiliated with Sierra Club, New Jersey. And my question was, the public health stressors that can't be avoided, how is that going to be defined? Do you have a list of items, chemicals or, air pollutants that you're going to draw that information from, or that's yet to be created? I'm just curious.
Yes. So I think it was 2 meetings ago, we went through our kind of brainstorming list of approximately 40 different stressor layers that we're considering. We're in the process of, based on the feedback we got from that meeting and after that meeting, we're working on kind of whittling that down to what we think will be our ultimate list of stressors. We're going to be in a position to discuss that at our next meeting in June, where we'll tell you exactly what stressors we think we would propose to use and why we would not have used any that we might think are, for a variety of reasons might not be appropriate for inclusion on that list. That will form the basis of the consideration and the analysis to be conducted by an applicant, by a proposed facility. They would need to look at their operations in relation to those existing stressors and figure out how they can avoid adding to the levels that are already in the overburden community.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Renee. Next is Dr. Sheets, and even for you, Dr. Sheets, if you can just give us your organizational affiliation, please. Thank you.
Certainly, sir. Especially for me, right, Olivia? So, Nikki Sheets, New Jersey, EJ Alliance, and the Center for the Urban Environment and the Watson Institute for Urban Policy and Research at King University. Sean, I've got several questions. I guess let's start. I'll probably have others later.
Yep.
And Professor Baptista and I were debating some things before we came on. But the first question is, in your first step, which I have here in front of me, it says using publicly available data, determine whether an overburdened community is subject to adverse environmental and public health stresses that are higher than the appropriate geographic point of comparison.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how we're interpreting that is that that's the part where you're going to do a cumulative impact analysis and basically assign some kind of cumulative impact score to every block in New Jersey.
Sorry, Doctor. I don't know if you have feedback or if somebody else is not on mute. So I'd ask everybody who's not Dr. Sheets to please put yourself on mute so I can make sure I'm hearing him.
You want me to repeat that, Sean?
If you wouldn't mind, my apologies.
Sure, no problem. Is that the part? At some point, what we're thinking is that you're going to have to do analysis and come up with for want of a better word, a cumulative impact score for essentially every.
Dr. Sheets, it looks like you're muted now. I'm not sure if you self-muted unintentionally.
I may have. Can you hear me now?
Sorry. Deepest apologies, Nikki.
No problem.
Good point. I want to hear it.
I probably did that. So here are kind of our assumptions to tell me where we go wrong here. At some point, you probably have to do a cumulative impacts analysis that assigns essentially, for want of a better word, a cumulative impact score to basically every block group in New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're going to have to look at the stressors of a particular facility and see what happens to that cumulative impact score.
Okay. Yeah. So generally speaking, yes, that's what we're talking about. I would like to spend some more time with you and Dr. Batista to dive a little bit deeper into what the appropriate methodology might be in order to do what, I will agree, lack of a better term, a score. I think that, there's potential for that type of score to be beneficial in terms of making that first level analysis, right? What I was thinking, or what we've been thinking about, is then you kind of take that and break it into its component parts, so that a facility needs to consider its contributions to the individual stressors as opposed to a cumulative stressor level. Thought that might end up being more protective and put a bit of a finer point on the analysis, as opposed to taking kind of that in aggregate and potentially not getting to some of those pieces. If you have a different thought in terms of that approach, would very much like to hear it, but that's kind of what we were thinking. Maybe that's a two-step process.
I think that's what I was going to say. I think in determining overall cumulative impact score, you're going to have to deal with the separate stressors and figure out how you aggregate it. And you can, use the California tool because they do that, right? Before they give an aggregate score, they take the individual stressors and they rank them by deciles. And then they aggregate the deciles. And I'm kind of assuming that's what's going to happen. And my first one is a question, and so this is all assumption right now. So my first question is, we are also kind of assuming DEP would do that first step for all the block groups in New Jersey.
Yes.
And provide those scores.
Yes. Yeah, that's what we're working on, right? And that's what the great Steve Anderson is gonna. That's why he doesn't sleep, is because we're working on doing that for all of the block groups. So you'll be able to click on any of them, look at all of that, and be able to look at if we can determine the appropriate methodology and kind of look at what that score is, and then be able to make that comparison. And then I think we'd be asking facilities to kind of do a finer analysis off of that.
So yes, and then all the analysis that you have listed in your preliminary list of requirements, then they're going to have to do analysis that's consistent with the way you handled that initial cumulative impact score, right? They're going to have to use that same methodology.
Correct.
Because at some point, they're going to have to add into that score.
Yes, exactly. Now, I'll just caveat that with just some annoying kind of APA Procedures Act stuff, right? So we can create a publicly available tool. We can make that the presumptive way to do it, right? We cannot necessarily mandate that folks use the tool. We can mandate that they use the methodology and kind of make apples to apples comparisons. So we would be mandating methodology, but not the specific tool, and providing the tool as essentially the easiest way to do that. If a facility came to us and said we followed the same analysis, we would have to confirm that, but we wouldn't be able to force them to use the online tool. That's the only thing I would offer in that situation.
Gotcha. Not necessarily. Yeah, same methods, but not necessarily same tool.
Exactly.
How would you handle it? This is one of our first questions, and I'll shut up so other people. We have more, but I'll shut up so other people can ask questions.
Just put your hand back up when you're done.
Okay. How would you handle it if it's a stressor? If there are stresses the facility, I don't want causes or encounters that are not part of the tool that will be used to calculate the initial cumulative impact score, or should the tool just be nimble enough to add on stressors that have not been used in that first calculation?
Yeah, I think so. That's a tough situation, and we've been thinking a lot about that, right? So we want the stressor layers to be broad enough.
That's a Baptista question, by the way.
What's that?
That's a Professor Baptista question.
Okay, well, thank you, Anna, for stumping me. So we want our stressor layer, and I think the term I've used here before is kind of the minimum necessary. So we want the stressor layers to be, usable and reliable, and to be based on the best data we can find. We also want that group of stressors that we decide to use to encompass as much of all of the things we would be worried about in a particular, in this setting, in overburdened communities as we can, right? I think our goal is to be able to have that universe of stressors cover all of the things that we would be concerned about, because we think that that's the way to make this whole thing as reliable and as objective as possible, which then insulates both the rule and the permitting decisions that the department might ultimately make thereunder, right? So I don't think that precludes necessarily some other catch-all where we think about other stressors that are not on the list. We have to think very hard in terms of how we would set that up. So I'm not saying we can't do it. I'm not saying we're not going to. I'm just saying it's something that we're thinking about. But to the best of our ability, we'd like that analysis and those stressor layers to be complete so that it does encompass the things that we'd be concerned about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think that's an interesting idea of the kind of catch-all category to, think ahead of time that you're going to miss something, because it's hard to include the entire universe of stressors.
Yeah, I mean, I think we would always aim to update the underlying data, as we move forward, depending on how we come up with the mechanics of the rule, adjusting, which stressors we consider might require amendments to the rule. But those are all things we were just talking about those today, and just in terms of how we set this up to allow us to be nimble. Nimble is a great word. We need to be able to react. We need to be able to understand how to make changes, to make them as efficiently and quickly as possible when there are public health issues that we may not have gotten on this first round. So all of that is in our minds.
Thanks, Sean. And nimble is the word that Rachel Morella Frost uses, from out of Berkeley. Yeah, she always uses that word.
I'm gonna try to put that in my vocabulary more. I like it. It's a good word.
Okay, Ray, we'll take your hand one more time. Thank you. Ray, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Did not do my mute. Since I didn't say it earlier, I'm here representing UU Faith Action of New Jersey as the co-chair of the Environmental Justice Task Force. The other question I had was on the previous slide or screen where you showed the minimum time framework for processing applications. And I'm curious if there are points along that timeline where DEP can stop the clock, such as declaring an application complete for review during the first, 20 days or 20 working days, or and then after the public hearing, if it's shown from the comments from the public that the applicant has failed to address significant information or significant need for information.
Sure. So so first, starting off, we're not able to consider it administratively complete until after the public hearing. So, where that might occur, and I'm also not saying we just automatically consider it administratively complete. I think there are ways that we can write the regulations to make sure that we have the complete and full information that's required to make sure the environmental justice impact statement is sufficient. We're going to touch a little bit on the department's role in this process, particularly with regard to review of an EJIS and our presence or lack thereof at any particular public hearing. I think we'll talk a little bit about that more then. I would just also offer that many of the permitting schemes that we're working under do not have mandatory timeframes for review. And most don't have, deemer provisions like you would see under our land resource protection regulations. So, we could consider what that means for a land use permit, but for air permits, water permits, a lot of the things that are more specifically keyed to addressing the presence of environmental and public health stressors, we have a bit more flexibility in terms of how long our review takes. So, points well taken. Certainly review times and all of that are things that, we're going to work to figure out mechanically once we start putting that rule language together.
Along those lines, with respect to existing facilities that are seeking renewal of a permit, the law does not permit you to deny them upfront or as a result of a public hearing. However, given the point that facilities may keep operating after the 5-year term of their existing permit, pending issuance of a new permit, this process, if they submitted incomplete information, could drag on for a long time with no changes in the operating conditions of the facility because it has an existing, albeit expired, permit. Is there going to be a provision whereby you say, hey, either fish or cut bait, meaning either make it complete application and we'll put in appropriate conditions that represent a new point in time, or stop operating or pay penalties or something. Where is the stick that gives the existing permit applicant, seeking renewal, encouragement, shall we say, to clean up their act to the maximum extent possible?
Yeah, we're gonna need to address that. It's a good point. Something we need to think about in terms of how we write the rule. I mean, I think the way the law is written, that the operating provision is kind of meant to not change any of the existing standards. I think that we have some inherent authority already to address those types of things. But yeah, we're gonna need to look at that. We'll have some thoughts at the next hearing.
Okay. The other way is, you mentioned that some of these operating permits don't have the kind of deadlines that land use permits have in them for making decisions. Do they have conditions or rules or requirements that require the department to render a decision that the applicant for renewal has not done a conscientious, complete job of filing for a permit renewal?
Not in that way. I mean, there are ways under our existing authority, under our inherent authority, that you can effectively end operations by folks not proceeding diligently with their renewal applications, right? Renewal application.
Pursuit of a solution is what I'm looking for.
Excuse me?
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, I got you. Okay, let's go to the next. So let's talk a little bit about where we kind of had that placeholder for 7. So what we've done here is just, 2 blind processes on the screen that talk a little bit about some of the more detailed aspects that we might be potentially include in a environmental justice impact statement, drawing from some of the existing impact statements that we have both in our laws as well as other states. So process 1 is from the Department's solid waste rules, whereas process 2 is from the New York DEC's rules related to the siting of major electric facilities as it relates to environmental justice issues. So I'm going to just kind of walk through some of these things. Generally speaking, what of these types of requirements speak to you? Which ones do you think should be included? Anything you think shouldn't be included? We'll go through some questions afterwards, but that's just, if you want to orient yourself in terms of what we're looking for here. So as I said, process 1 is derived from the department's requirements for an environmental and health impact statement under the solid waste rules. And that at present is regarding disposal activities. We're kind of using this as a potential, I won't say template, but area to draw from as we would graft additional requirements on top of what we talked about on the last slide, which are kind of the basic requirements that come from the statute. Under the solid waste rules, an EJIS is prepared using a systematic interdisciplinary approach in order to ensure the integrated assessment of technical, economic, environmental, and social parameters potentially affected by the proposed facility. So I think some of that resonates quite well with what we're talking about here in terms of environmental justice impact statement. So let's go through some of the individual elements. First, pretty basic and administrative descriptive information, maps, that's basically your executive summary describing the proposed facility. We get into a little bit more detail as we go through this list. Second is an environmental summary where you'd be considering physical and chemical properties of the facility and the surrounding area, looking at geology, soil types, subsurface hydrology, water bodies, tributaries, topography, climate, ambient air quality, and other ambient acoustical conditions or noise levels. Also, this would require a review of biological and ecological characteristics, so plants, mammals, birds, threatened and endangered species, particular, critical, or unusual habitat, the ecosystem or biotic community. Also requires applicants to consider the cultural aspects of the community, so recreational activities and aesthetics, and socioeconomic, so transportation facilities, the presence of sewage or stormwater management facilities, the water supply, energy supply, demographics, property values, public service, and then kind of the presence of community and residential dwellings. So that's kind of you're setting up your background and baseline through those types of things. Then you would be assessing under this process what the proposed facility operations look like. So the description, the purpose, and this gets into some of the economic aspects, potential markets, economic analysis, the construction schedule, as well as a process narrative that explains the equipment, the process, the capacity, how all that, anything generated there is going to be disposed of, and where it's going to be getting its inputs from. I think in the situation of an environmental justice impact statement, this would necessarily include an analysis of traffic, an analysis of how the facility proposed to both bring in and remove anything that it's processing on site, and where those routes are going to be, both in relation to the overburdened community. We also talk about in this type of process the federal, state, county, and local land use connections and permits. So what other permits are implicated by this potential facility? How does it fit within the local zoning and the various environmental regulations, including things like wetlands, tidelands, looks at critical and endangered species, basically things that we would otherwise be interested in as an environmental agency when assessing a potential operation. It also goes through environmental assessments. So, your positive and negative impacts, what modeling techniques the facility would have used, contaminant migration pathways, and a quantification of impacts, and as we've talked about before, avoidance techniques. Health impact assessment, so methodology, again, the level of uncertainty, potential contaminants, ways that they would have assessed health risks for those contaminants, toxicity profiles for anything being used or stored on site, all of those things, as well as potential and existing adverse impacts from those assessments. So looking at all that information, and where are those impacts going to be seen, where are they unavoidable, and if they're unavoidable, identify them or set forth the measures to avoid them. It also includes, which I think is something that's worth conversation and particularly worth highlighting here, is alternatives. So that would include an alternative no action or no project, as well as alternative design or process changes, so feasibility, economic analysis, and the significant differences in impacts, essentially a comparison matrix between those different alternatives. That alternatives analysis could include a siting alternative, as we talk about, particularly facilities seeking to be sited, new facilities in an OBC who might be looking for a compelling public interest qualification. We could ask them to consider different siting options, which I think we talked about a little bit before. And we kind of look at process two, not all that different, but a little bit of a different twist. Again, this is from New York. This is specifically keyed by the state of New York to environmental justice issues, and the particular context being the setting of major electric generating facilities. So there's definitely some overlap there, the electric generating facilities potentially being covered as Title V facilities. So again, your executive summary, your administrative or descriptive information, and a narrative of what that project looks like. Here, they would be looking at a cumulative impact analysis of air quality. So examining all the pollutants, the total impacts of those pollutants, as well as identifying comparison areas. Again, very relevant to what we're talking about here when we talk about geographic points of comparison or geographic area or areas that might be appropriate to consider the presence of stressors, as well as comprehensive demographic, economic, and physical descriptions. In these regulations, they specifically call for those descriptions to be made from quote unquote reasonably available data, but they include demographic and economic information about population, race, ethnicity, income, as well as physical data related to public health and air quality, concentration of facilities, open space, historical cultural resources, visual or aesthetic resources, water quality, ambient sound level, and traffic. Again, a lot of things that track with what we've talked about, particularly when we're talking about how we build those stressor levels. And they have a nice catch-all here, which we always appreciate. Any other information reasonably necessary to provide an accurate and complete representation of the project. It's good language out of New York. Also considering an evaluation of significant or adverse disproportionate environmental impacts. Again, keep saying it, this is all kind of relevant to what we're talking about. As they say, using generally accepted statistical methods to evaluate whether and to what extent the impact study area has significant and adverse disproportionate environmental impacts. I think we would aim in our regulations to put a little bit more specificity on that, to provide a little bit more predictability, both for an applicant as well as the community and the department, to maybe be a little bit more specific than appropriate statistical methods, trying to kind of provide a little bit more direction to how that should be done. It requires a comparing and contrasting to a geographic point of comparison. It requires an analysis of reasonable and available alternative locations, and it requires an identification of measures taken to avoid, and in their language, offset or minimize, but I'm going to emphasize avoid each of those impacts. And last but certainly not least, what they call a statement of environmental justice issues, which is really a summary of that final environmental justice analysis, an evaluation of those significant adverse and disproportionate impacts, a rationale for any conclusions made within that statement, including sources, and what measures they would propose to avoid. So I hope that gives us just a little bit of context to some of the other things that might be relevant here, some of the other things that might be appropriate to consider as we write the rule. If you're looking at this and you're seeing kind of these two processes, does either one in whole or in part resonate with you as including things that, when you hear them described, you think that's absolutely right for conclusion in environmental justice impact statement? Or are there things that strike you as just not being appropriate, going beyond the bounds of what what interested parties in the community might want to hear about or might want to know about? And then again, just highlighting that question of alternatives. What types of alternatives should the department require to be included in an environmental justice impact statement? And ultimately, kind of what would we be focusing on siting, focusing on operations, focusing on both, focusing on something else in an alternatives analysis. Those are kind of the framing questions. If folks want to jump in here and give us any feedback, we'd love to hear it. Dr. Sheets.
I waited for other people to jump in. I waited.
I think everybody wants to hear from you first. Thank you.
You'd be surprised how many people don't want to hear from me, Sean. One question is that I guess that all the indicators we had talked about before, like climate risk and flooding and all that, is somehow included in these examples. But Sean, what's your opinion? When I read the law, I read it saying you have to determine if granting the permit will cause higher cumulative adverse environmental and public health stressors in that block group.
Mm-hmm.
Does that imply that anything you're taking into account has to be able to be reduced to some kind of quantitative score that we can include in that cumulative impact score that we were talking about earlier? Is it all just about whether those stresses are higher and we're going to do that through a score, or can you take into account something else besides, that cumulative impact score that would tell you whether stresses are higher in that block group?
That's interesting. I think we can. If you're asking me for my opinion about whether we can, yes, I think we can. I think that where we would like to be is to have a broad enough and comprehensive enough list of stressors so that we have some predictability to the analysis the department needs to undertake. And I do truly believe that puts us in a much better position to defend any permit decisions we would make, particularly permit denials. But I'm not sure that necessarily precludes, broadly and in kind of the inherent authority of the commissioner under the environmental justice law and under the subsequent regulations to consider things that are outside of that, right? So I don't, it's probably not something that's easily kind of articulated into example, but, if we went through this analysis and we looked at all the stressors and they were able to, the facility was able to avoid all the impacts to all the stressors that are at close or above levels, but there was some major thing that we didn't consider, and there was information in the record that showed that was going to lead to an adverse cumulative impact in the community. I think that's something the department could certainly take into account. I don't think we would limit our decision-making authority, but I do think we aim to make this make this as objective as possible, again, just for the reasons that we've talked about. But we're not necessarily looking to tie our own hands in that situation to make a decision that is contrary to the protection of public health and in particular the burden community.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
We do have a comment in the chat from Joanne Held, who is a member of our Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So since you do not have a question here, we're just going to make note that we've received your comment. So thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you, Joanne.
And now we have a few hands. Let's see. First, I'm going to take Maria Lopez Nunez.
Hi, I'm Maria Lopez with Ironbound Community Corporation. I'm just wondering, and this might be a silly question, but I'm not a scientist, but in terms of all these assessments, one thing that I guess is standing out to me is that we don't have like an air monitor in the Ironbound, right? So like in our zip code, like there isn't actually, how would you measure the levels of PM 2.5 or other cold pollutants in our neighborhood? So what I would like to hear a little bit about the plan for DP, because if you just use the number from Newark, that air monitor is up the hill, and like as someone that reports bad smells constantly, I know the way the wind blows really matters, right? And how smells go away and the impact that they might have. So I'm just concerned about the block groups having the appropriate level of data and close enough, like that's actually in the neighborhood as opposed to this aggregate data that I feel like the department currently has. If there's a plan for that, because I feel like it's going to be key and crucial for the implementation of whatever process we ultimately land on. Because if there's bad data, or it's, I don't know. I am concerned, I guess you keep saying about this aggregate thing. And I was like, wait, do we even have the specific data points on some of these issues? So.
Yeah, that's a fair question, Maria. So I think I'll try to answer it a couple of different, hit on a couple of different points. So, from a strictly data perspective, right, we have to use what we have available to us at this point in order to kind of create these layers, right? So if there's not specific monitoring data to a specific block group, in the Ironbound, for instance, we would be using modeling or existing data to try to extrapolate down to the specific block group. Now, in addition to that, I think that the state's overall commitment to environmental justice, we need to be and are thinking about ways in which how do we get better data, right? And we would be updating the data that underlays this analysis as we are able to obtain better data. And things that are on our mind when we look at that are how do we get more localized data? How do we deal with monitoring in communities? I don't have a specific set of answers sitting here right now on that, but I will tell you it's something that has not been ignored. We've had some conversations with folks. I think that I'm hopeful that in the future, in the not too distant future, we're going to be able to continue to generate better and better data, and then that data would be integrated into this process so that we are not relying on anything that is less than the best and most reliable data we have for a given block group at any particular moment in time. So whether we have it now or later, as soon as we have it, we're going to continue to put it in. And I think that through the work that Olivia's office does, through the work that the governor's office is doing to live up to our principles of environmental justice, I'm hopeful that we're going to get to a position where we're going to have better data to be able to serve those communities more directly and to really assess those impacts. Now, it may be to Dr. Sheets's point that there is that additional monitoring data is presented as part of an environmental justice impact statement process that we might not have as part of our data sets that might be relevant. I don't think there's anything in what we'll set up that would preclude that. We would need to consider how exactly we use that, reliability and other things, but part of that is to bring out part of the public hearing, part of the public comment process is to bring out whatever information folks have. If there is local monitoring data, we would I think take that into account as we're trying to make assessments.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Sean. Next, Ray Nichols. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
You have to unmute my mic. Again, I'm with Faith Action of New Jersey, a Unitarian Universalist organization that looks at the ethical aspects of what's happening here. And unless I missed it, I didn't hear Sean make explicit reference to climate change as an environmental parameter that should be examined. Many of these communities and many of these facilities are close to mean high tide and elevation, and there are many models in existence that are saying there's sea level rise. The only question is how soon, how much. So given that these facilities tend to be relatively long-lived, I think it's important that the applicants for permits address potential sea level rise using well-developed, scientifically recognized data that has been prepared in New Jersey. There's organizations in Princeton, at Rutgers, that have been doing that modeling for a long period of time. I think that should be taken into account. Sea level rise leads to flooding, which leads to widespread distribution of waterborne pollutants that can affect people's lives and health. I'll leave it there. With respect to more monitoring points and equipment, I guess one of the good things from what I understand of the air quality program as opposed to the land use programs is that they have built in over the years fees to cover inspections by DEP staff. I realize it may not be as frequently as some people would like, and there's also the ability to respond to emergency situations. But we're talking about an ongoing need for data, not for reacting to emergency situations. And therefore, as the technology has improved, it would seem to me that DEP should be in a position to install permanent automatic recording equipment on the top of publicly owned buildings in OBCs, and they could be sending data to Trenton automatically through satellites or other technology. The USGS has been doing this for years with water stream monitoring. And to pay for that, I think there should be a fee added to all the permit fees of the air quality programs. And that could be done then relatively simply. You could bond for it and then have the fees as they come in repay the bonds. Sorry, Sean, your mic is off.
Thank you. I said we'll note the second comment, and I will just say to the first regarding the need to address flooding and sea level rise. I would wholeheartedly agree with that, and we certainly aim to ensure that occurs both in this and as well as our other major initiative at the department, which is NJ Pact, and the rules will propose to update our flood hazard, coastal area, and wetlands rules to address the fact that they are outdated and do not account for the rapidly changing levels of the sea and additional precipitation levels. So all of those things I think will work in that regard, but the note of a need to include that analysis and consideration is well taken.
Okay. Any thoughts on the monitoring equipment?
While I sit here, I mean, I think I'm not as well steeped in the financial aspects of the department as I might wish I am, or wish I'm not. I will say that I think your suggestion is a good one. Exactly how we might be able to do that sitting here today, I don't know, but certainly something that we're already talking about in our collective behind the scenes, make sure we're taking notes on things we want to address chat. So it's been heard, and would love to see us do something about it.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. All right. Let's continue to move forth. So we're going to kind of go into what we're just calling other considerations, but they are not other, they are just more miscellaneous with relation to the environmental justice impact statement process. So we're going to just talk a little bit about meaningful public participation, something I think we've touched on several times here, but specifically with regard to notice and the provision of an environmental justice impact statement to individuals in the community, and how we can ensure that that is done in a way that that provides folks with the information they need to be able to adequately and appropriately address the things that are set forth therein. So we can pop forward, I think, 2 slides. There we go. So again, our broad kind of mission statement question for this is really, how can the department ensure meaningful public participation in the environmental justice impact statement process? We've touched on this before. We're going into a little bit more detail, particularly in relation to some of the statutory things we laid out earlier. We did that day 0 chart, where we laid out kind of the minimum things that the statute requires. I want to talk about what we might be wise to include beyond that in terms of being able to get the information in people's hands. So a couple of the questions that we have here, are the statutory methods of notice, including newspapers, which requires them to be in circulation in the overburdened community, and one to be a local non-English newspaper, as well as the department's website and the DEP bulletin, sufficient to provide notice and meaningful information to folks. Our newspaper is the most effective way. I think I likely know the answer, but we framed the question that way. But how else can an applicant reach the community? What other ways should we be considering mandating or encouraging? And on the issue of languages, and we've done actually a little research on this today to try to see what some of our sister agencies are doing, but kind of how should we direct an applicant to determine which languages notice should be translated into? We recognize that one non-English translation may not be sufficient to ensure that we're getting to the folks who are going to be most impacted by the potential facility operations. Also for consideration are the statutory methods of making an environmental justice impact statement available. That includes providing a copy to the governing body of the municipality and the clerk, as well as placing it on the DEP website. Are those sufficient? Are there better ways that we can make that information available? Should applicants be required to create a microsite where they house all of these things? Is that something that makes sense to folks? And then kind of a little bit of a different flavor, but something that we've previewed a little bit. To what extent should the department participate in or attend an environmental justice impact public hearing? I think from the department's perspective, we certainly at that point of the process do not want to be seen as endorsing a project. We also don't want to be in a position to have to give feedback on something we haven't reviewed in any real level of detail, but perhaps it might make sense for the department to be in the room, one, to lay the groundwork and set the ground rules of what an environmental justice process is going to look like and how the particular hearing fits into a larger permitting process, to help to ensure that information is adequately communicated to members of the community in a way that perhaps the applicant might not be as well versed in, and potentially in addition, it makes sense for us just to be there to make sure we're hearing firsthand the concerns of the community, to avoid anything being lost in translation when those comments are transcribed and provided to us 10 days after the public hearing as a supplement to the environmental justice impact statement. So we've got a couple of slides in this vein. Those are the questions we have for this one. Happy to hear what anyone might have to provide us in that regard.
So I do want to recognize first a comment with questions that was placed into the chat, because they came in right when we started talking again. So
okay. Yep. Arena Gorski-Steiner asks, what qualifications will be required of those performing these impact analysis so we can trust they're accurate? And will Steve Anderson be discussing his index methodology plans in the upcoming meeting, and agreeing with Dr. Sheets that this is a critical component? So take the second question first. Absolutely. As at the next meeting, we're going to be running through, the basically litany of the things we would propose to do in the to be drafted rule that are going to be hopefully responsive to the comments we've received thus far. As part of that, we'll be laying out the specific stressors we'd like to use, as well as the methodology we would use to address those. I don't think I have a specific answer to what qualifications individuals should be required to possess to do that. I think that that's something that that is very worth consideration. I think we need to write around that. And if you have any specific suggestions that you'd like to provide us now or later, anybody here, about what types of certifications, what type of education we should be looking at, certainly do our due diligence on that and make sure it's accurate, but very open to suggestions in that regard as well.
Great. And now we can take Julia Summers' hand. And Julia, just remember to tell us your organizational affiliation. Thank you.
Olivia, hello. This is Julia Summers with the New Jersey Highlands Coalition. I am following this conversation with great interest, but I have particular interest from the west coast of New Jersey, not the east coast of New Jersey. And they don't have any newspapers. I mean, they don't exist. The newspapers that serve the west coast of New Jersey are Pennsylvania newspapers. And how people in overburdened communities are expected to know about what is going on is a challenge. You don't even know if they have access to computers and so on. So I think that when that is the case, when there is, I recognize there is almost certainly a newspaper of record that the community uses, but that doesn't, or the town uses, but that does not necessarily mean it is a newspaper that the community uses. So maybe there should be a requirement that the applicant should hire a company that will do some meaningful outreach to reach the community. And I suspect this is probably an issue, not just on the west coast of New Jersey, but in other communities. Because I don't care. If this means putting signs on lampposts, maybe that there's a community meeting coming up, maybe that's what should be required. And maybe somebody should be hired to do that. How those expectations are put together, I don't think it should be complicated, but I don't think we should be requiring reliance on newspapers when there isn't a community newspaper, or we should be relying on the use of the internet. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Next, Joanne Held.
Thank you. Joanne Held, I'm on the Environmental Justice Advisory Council and also serve on the Camden Collaborative Initiative and a couple of other things around here. And I want to follow up on what Julia just said and what sort of Sean intimated too, is that, yeah, we definitely don't want to just rely on newspapers. So what is the other way to do it? One is to get, put the burden on the company, but I've seen instances where the company developed their own like little community group and they all loved the company. And so it wasn't as unbiased as you'd want it to be. I don't know how hard it would be, but it seems that perhaps the department could identify at least one community organization in each of these 300 some neighborhoods that would also be informed. They're the people who are talking to the neighbors, who can put those flyers up on the lamp posts and that sort of thing. It's something that our Outreach and Education Committee thought about for a while with Environmental Justice Advisory Council, trying to figure out how to put together a list like that. We've got a preliminary list, not long enough for what you need, but I think you need to engage a community group in each of these communities, at least one, maybe multiples. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. I think it's a wonderful point. Certainly something that we've discussed as well. I think it's incumbent upon the department, and I think we are and will continue to work on developing an accurate and appropriate list of community groups who should be included in these conversations. We can ensure that folks that are interested, that we know about, are getting that information. Certainly sensitive to any perception that somehow shifts the burden. But I think your point about just making sure that those folks have the information, they can do what they want with it, they can publicize it the way that they think is appropriate. But at least making sure that that at minimum, in addition to the other any other requirements might put in place, that that interested and engaged community groups have that information so that they can ensure that their membership is made aware. I think that's a no-brainer. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I do want to add a piece here because it's come up obviously in several comments, and I want to talk about the complementary process we have going on to the law rulemaking, and that is the work of the Environmental Justice Executive Order. Through that effort, the Office of Environmental Justice has reached out to every department and agency across state government. So as a part of our conversing with them, we have spoken with every department and agency about the ways that they connect with overburdened communities. And we think that there are definitely some points of contact that other agencies have that we don't, that we will do some more leaning on as we're moving forward with some of these processes, namely like reaching out to communities of faith, doing more where we can to integrate with other community-based organizations, county level boards of social services, and the like. So we are definitely taking a really good look at how we can make our outreach network much more robust. And we'll be sure to share like that cross-pollinating information between those two initiatives as we carry forward. One other piece that I do want to make everyone aware of is that we're looking to do an update to our department's limited English proficiency plan. So we are going to have some data in hand where we know we've at least exercised a good level of due diligence in making sure that we're reaching the right communities as we're advancing. Once the rule is in place, we'll definitely have a limited English proficiency plan in place to complement that. So we're really making touch points on the ground in the respective communities. And we'll share that publicly as well once that's done. Okay, so that's enough from me. And now we'll go to Sharonda Allen.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Sharonda Allen. I'm in East Orange, New Jersey. I'm the founder and executive director of Operation Grow, Inc. It is a federally tax-exempt New Jersey nonprofit, and my short mission is for human, economic, social, and environmental sustainability. So I, in my own organization, do a lot of work. I just did the Pay Up Climate Polluters postcard party with some of my youth a few days ago. And I'm also a trained Al Gore climate reality leader, and I'm a member of the New Jersey Greater Gateway Climate Reality Leadership Corps group here in New Jersey. There used to be a northern and a southern New Jersey organization, but they merged. So I would love to be put on the list to receive information so that our organization can disseminate it to our particular audience. And also I would be willing to share information that my youth could create awareness campaigns for, so that they could earn community service hours here in the state of New Jersey as their state mandated graduation requirement. So I've heard, things like, I don't look at anybody's newspaper. My stuff is online or on television because I don't have the time to sit down and fold up a bunch of papers. I know that's probably bad, but a lot of things are with social media, Instagram, and I would not mind engaging my youth to do such things, and also the folks in my organization, the Climate Reality Leadership Corps, which I'm actually on the advocacy committee. So we could also advocate for, more of, the legislation, of course, and just advocate for the people learning and knowing about what you guys are working on in this particular committee here.
Well, speaking, that sounds wonderful, and thank you for that, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
I want to obviously defer more to Olivia on this, but we'd love to get your contact information, whether you want to put it in the chat or send us an email
Sure.
with an address at the end.
Sure,
I
I'll
think
put
we'd
everything.
love to connect with you.
Thank you. I'll put everything in the chat.
Okay.
Thank you.
As long as you're comfortable with that. Thank you, Shereen.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I also want to give recognition to several comments that were placed in the chat that reinforce what we've been talking about in the conversation. So I gave a thumbs up to all of them so that you know that I actually saw them. So they are on the record. So thank you so much.
And to Maria's specific comment, I was going to suggest that. I didn't want to steal your thunder. So thank you for putting it in the chat.
Okay, great. And Ray Nichols? Don't forget to unmute yourself. Okay, Sean, maybe we'll carry on and we'll give Ray another opportunity to speak later.
Oh, we actually just have
Oh, a new hand.
My hand up.
we got-
I believe in the freshwater wetlands rules, there used to be at least the ability for a non-governmental organization to notify DEP a priori, meaning at the beginning of time, to say that anytime an application comes in within this geographic area we're interested in, please send us a copy of the notice that it exists. With neighborhood organizations, with various languages, and for all the reasons we've described, time is of the essence if the public hearing may be as soon as 60 days. I know there was one time recently I was notified 3 days before there was a public hearing, and the information I got was very incomplete. This came from a community group. So, many of these community groups, or churches for that matter, if they have a service significant population, might be willing to say, well, anybody within our zip code or within our municipal code, we'd like to know about their application as soon as possible. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Ray. Another good suggestion.
Oh, public libraries.
Yes. Okay. Thank you again.
Thank you. And Natalie Augusto-Filion?
Hi, Natalie Augusto-Filion with the City of Newark Office of Sustainability. I'm Chief Sustainability Officer there, and wanted to just kind of point out one element, less of a question and more of a comment about the process. I believe that the meeting that you said is happening in June will be the last session. And it occurs to me, having been on all of the sessions, and they've all been very thorough and also very intentionally creating space for this kind of conversation, that there's going to be a lot to kind of summarize in a small amount of time if you're planning on doing a 2-hour session. So I wanted to flag that there might be value in breaking that up or offering it twice in order to allow for as much conversation as we've had, the benefit of being able to have in all the 5 sessions to date. So that's one comment to throw out there. And, another comment that's a kind of obvious one, but hasn't been stated yet, is just to say that if we're recommending, and I think I'm hearing that from some of the conversation here, that local organizations, community-based organizations, neighborhood associations, Black associations, faith groups, etc., would be leveraged for the outreach, that there be a best practice. I doubt the department can create a requirement, but certainly a best practice that those organizations be compensated for their time supporting community outreach. I know that there, groups like Maria's and others are, really good at getting the word out, and really good at flyering, and really good at, phone trees and all the other sort of tenets of community organizing that applicants might not be so good at, because that's really not their bread and butter. And in those instances, it makes a lot of sense to sort of recommend some kind of basic framework for compensation of those organizations that are being called upon. One more comment, I'm sorry, because I didn't look at a clock or anything. I was on the phone earlier listening to the first entire hour, and there was no process for sort of participating in the conversation as someone on the phone. So just flagging that, because there was a call-in option and I wasn't able to join at my computer until after 7. And then last comment is just to say that I want to iterate a little bit on something that Maria noted earlier about the availability of health data. I think many folks on this call know that I've been leading the charge for Newark to develop our first ever environmental resources inventory, which is developing a baseline of environmental and public health data with Irina Gorski-Skyner's support and others in the team. And the availability of downscaled data of relevance to public health matters is really very challenging. I'm sure that you are hitting that internally and trying to think through that. I'm very curious about the conversations that you've been having and the ways that you've been trying to solve for that in that step 1 initial screen. And just noting that, the OBCs are everywhere around the state, not just in the 100 cities, health data areas where those of us with larger population numbers and density can access certain data layers that are not available everywhere in the state. And I think it's going to be imperative that DEP leverage its relationship with DOH to be able to make some of those, make some kind of guidelines for how this public health data at the block group scale can help inform decision making. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. I'll just on the, oh boy. No, there we go. Okay. Just on the issue of data. I mean, so we are, we're pressing forward on a very aggressive schedule to do this, right? We want to be proposed. We're working to be proposed as close to the year anniversary of signature on that bill as we can, and that creates potentially some limitations in terms of how much data work we can do on this. And I will say first round of rulemaking. Our work here will not be done upon publication and ultimate adoption and defense of this rule. The department's commitment to ensuring the best data will continue on way past that. And as we are able to continue to develop better information, we're going to incorporate that into our tools, and we're going to continue to work to make ourselves better. So you have that commitment from the department that this is not the end of the journey. We're not just going to put out what we have now and say that's good enough. We're going to continue to work to refine it, continue to work to make it better, and continue to be able to more accurately assess those impacts as we move forward. So thank you for all of those comments. And I think this is just a great, this has been such an incredibly useful and informative conversation. I just want to give kudos to every single person who's spoken, every person who's put a comment in the chat. This is exactly what we need to be able to put this rule together. And I just want to very sincerely thank you all for this. And we're not even done yet, but just so far I've been blown away with the level of engagement and just the, frankly, just incredibly helpful feedback we've gotten thus far. So thank you all.
Absolutely. I strongly echo those sentiments. And also just with regard to a comment that Natalie made, I just wanted to take a moment for the people who may be on the phone and let you know that if you do want to say something and your line is muted by us, just press *6 and we'll give you a moment to do that now if there's something you'd like to say, because we know you can't gracefully raise your hand at another interval. So we'll do this now, and I'll do a *6 phone ask later as well. So let's give a moment for that in case there's anyone on the phone who wants to speak. *6 is how you get off of mute.
All right. All right, let's go to the next one, and any phone people, please feel free to interrupt me. I want there to be more space for you to talk with me. Let's talk a little, just go through some more of these questions that we've kind of teed up, just really process related. So something that we're looking at and thinking about is really, should the regulations have kind of a pre-application phase where the department determines if the environmental justice impact statement is sufficient? Should we be able to request revisions to an EJIS after the applicant has distributed it, after the public hearing, or any other time therein? Should the environmental justice impact statement be included with the final permit issued? When is it appropriate? We talked about this earlier with the department having discretion. When is it appropriate for the department to require an additional public hearing? Should the department require an applicant to provide written responses to the comments received during the public comment period or at the public hearing? Tend to think we probably should be doing that, but we're trying to ask as many open-ended questions as we can. My thought, and I've told this to everyone, is that a bunch of comments without responses is not particularly useful to anyone. And should there be an additional or extended public comment period after the public hearing? I think Ray Nichols, who did have to leave, kind of left something in this regard, or mentioned it in one of his statements. The public hearing might inform people of the process. It might inform people who have been paying attention to the process in a way that's different than what they've been able to glean from written documents. Should there be an extension of comment period after that public hearing, or should there be certain conditions upon which we would consider that? So just some of the questions for this piece, and we have one more slide after this, and then we'll open up for any other comments that folks have that maybe are not as directly keyed to these. Last slide only has two very brief questions, so kind of open season at this point for anybody who wants to jump in and ask or comment or whatever you'd like to do.
Okay, Dr. Sheets?
I have a couple additional technical questions, but I'll hold those, Sean, to the last part. But
sure.
I really want to respond. Should there be an additional extended public comment period after the public hearing? Under what conditions? I think, so someone who does a lot of comments, yes. I mean, I think especially if you're getting the sense, I guess it has to go both ways, but especially if it's contentious, and I think if the community is, for us, if the community is opposing a project, I think additional time after the public hearing can be key, because that public hearing really sometimes consolidates your thinking. You get other people. Hear from other people, and that would be very helpful, especially the community organizations who don't have the resources that facilities do, and the time to prepare those comments. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sheets.
Can I ask a question kind of related to this?
Of course.
I was looking for the I can't find the law quickly, but there is a portion of the law that says, and I can't remember exactly how it's phrased, that the department should be, a fee should be assessed to cover the department's expenses, while being in this process. And I think, and I can get to you later with the exact wording, there was two ways to interpret that the fee only goes towards the department's cost of participating in the process, but then some of us were wondering, could that fee also be used to pay for experts for a community group participate in the process?
Yeah, I can actually, you gave me enough time to pull it up in front of me. So it says, it's section G, I believe it says, in addition to other fee authorized by law, rule, or regulation, the department shall assess each permit application a reasonable fee in order to cover the department's costs associated with the implementation of this act, including costs to provide technical assistance to permit applicants and overburdened communities as needed to comply with this act. I think that, I think as you've indicated, that may provide a fair bit of discretion on the department's behalf in terms of how we might be able to set up a fee structure. APA requires us to be able to demonstrate the reasonableness of those fees, and often would require us to do a level of analysis to do that. But we have some flexibility there, and certainly something that we've been talking about, including discussing today already, in terms of how we might go about doing that. So it's definitely on our mind, and I think your question and the point implied there is well taken.
Thank you, Nikki. Natalie?
Hi again, Natalie Augusto-Filion with the City of Newark, Chief Sustainability Officer. The question that's posed here about whether there's a pre-application phase or whether there's a need to sort of redistribute if changes are made. What I would flag to the question that Irina posed earlier about qualifications is that whoever is making the determination of completeness internal to NJDEP should at least do some basic training in racial equity and justice, and to understand sort of in a very racially explicit way the impacts of the disproportionate burden. And then also, in addition to sort of having that training be part of the department's commitment to advancing environmental justice and equity, to have the opportunity for reissuing in instances where there's a need to make a significant improvement on the EJIS or anything like that. Sometimes, for any number of reasons, information that is really key to decision-making process and to having the community adequately involved is missing or lacking in the application. And so I think there should be an opportunity for there to be revisions made based on community request or based on the department making a determination that there's insufficient data provided in the first iteration of the EJIS.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. And just again, I want to take a moment if there is anyone on a phone line who would like to make a comment. *6 to unmute yourself. Okay, we'll carry forward.
All right, so these are just the last two questions, I think, building on and some, potentially overlapping on some of the things we talked about. But I think, Nikki got to this. I think a lot of folks have touched on this, and just in terms of what type of support should the department provide to ensure the content of the EJIS is understandable, to ensure that it's accurate, to ensure that any changes there too are communicated back to the community. I think all of those things are things that we've heard about, and folks have additional thoughts. We'd love to hear them. And I think that second question kind of covers that. So if folks have anything that they'd like to particularly add to this process-related conversation, now would be a wonderful time. Otherwise, I think Dr. Sheets at least had a couple of more technical questions, so this might be a good place to go through those as well.
Okay, Dr. Sheets, the floor is yours.
Well, actually, I just have one more technical question. Just something we're kind of worried about, Sean, Olivia, is that if a block group, once you do the cumulative impact score for all the block groups, and let's say we're assuming that if the score of the block group, when you add the stressors to it from that particular facility, is above the 50th percentile, say, then that will trigger a denial. But say if before you add the stressors caused by that particular facility, block group is below the 50th percentile, and we're worried that we're hoping that the tool, let me put it another way, the tool will be sensitive enough so that under the right circumstance, however we want to define that it could be that the stressors caused by the facility will bring that block group above the 50th percentile.
Right.
We can see a situation where, if you're below the 50th percentile, it's going to stay there no matter that particular facility is not going to make a big enough difference because of just the amount of pollution in the block group to really, move it up in the rankings.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a good point. I will confess I've been thinking about that specific issue more in an individualized context where you're looking at a specific stressor, not in the aggregate. Obviously, you're highlighting something we need to think more about and make sure that there's sensitivity in the analysis and in the tool to be able to address those types of things. We can't be allowing, we're not in the business of creating more communities that are suffering disproportionate impacts. So we should not allow that to inadvertently happen as a result of some oversight. So thank you for pointing that to us, and we're going to work to address it.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Andrew Gold.
Hi, Andrew Gold with Pinelands Preservation Alliance. If I could, I just, on the question before the last question that was up on the slide about the responses from the applicant to written comments in the impact statement. I mean, I do think that the applicant should have to respond in writing to any written comments that are provided, but I also assumed, but I should ask, I assume DEP would also be providing, I mean, at least when you get to the permit decision stage, you're going to provide responses to written comments from that hearing as well. That's a question I have.
Yeah, so I think the way the law is written, which just makes it a little bit different from kind of some of our other permitting laws, is that it puts the burden to do these things on the applicant more than the department. So the applicant has to hold the hearing. Often the department is holding the hearing. The applicant has to collect and address the comments. Often the department is doing that. Now, I don't think that prevents us from doing that as well. I think we would be in that situation, most likely reviewing the response to comments, ensuring their accuracy and completeness. And if they're not accurate and complete, pushing back to the applicant and requiring them to make revisions to ensure that they are fully addressing those comments. Whether the department would specifically issue a separate response to comments from the environmental justice impact statement portion of this, I'm not certain, but we would be issuing some type of decision that would come from this, which would include our analysis of the comments received and how we think those, the analysis of the comments received, analysis of all the information provided in the EJIS, and how that impacts our ultimate permitting decision with regard to the finding of a disproportionate impact, disproportionate cumulative impact higher than. So, we're going to be reviewing all of that. We're definitely going to be issuing some sort of written document, whether it's a formal kind of response to comments or whether it is something that is analyzing and reflecting what the applicant has done. I think it's more likely to be the latter, but I don't think that would be a reflection of any sort of lack of process or review by the department.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Actually, I had one more thought about the slide you have up now. One thing I've thought about is whether DEP might ever consider creating like some kind of community liaison kind of position or positions within the EJ division, really just like for informational purposes and for whether it's if there are hearings coming up in a community and to try and educate people about what the process is, or whether it's like this, what you have up now with, helping the community understand what is in the impact statement, things along those lines. It's just a thought I had. I wanted to put it out there.
Sure. Olivia, would this be one to defer to you on?
Certainly. I can tell you that has certainly been a part of our internal deliberations. So we thank you for also raising that as a suggestion.
Sure. Thanks.
Yep, you're welcome. And Natalie?
Thank you. Sorry, it took me a second to find the unmute. Thanks again. Apologies if I'm taking too much airspace here, but I wanted to build on the previous commenter because even though he said sort of liaisons in DEP, apologies from some background noise at home, there's a practice that's used widely in multiple states. I can think of like Milwaukee's Water School, or there's like a new there's a new program out of California that it sort of empowers. I think they call them stewards with with training and sort of deep information. And there's this cohort of people essentially that serve as kind of ambassadors. They're funded, they go through a training program. Baltimore has a planning academy that does exactly this. And it takes a lot of this like wonky technical stuff and it makes it more accessible. So the first question about making information more understandable, I think if the department has some method that that replicates or learns from the health, what do they call them? The sort of health communicators, you know, that function of person who makes it possible for, you know, moms and folks in the neighborhood, et cetera, to better understand health resources. Something like that, sort of a communicator, an interpreter, an ambassador, whatever the right title is, but developing a kind of training program that really allows at least some small cohort of residents to better understand how they can advocate for environmental justice in their communities. I know ICC has done a program like that in the past. I'm working with the Newark Green Team on launching one focused on climate justice for high school age students. And what I've seen from my counterparts and sustainability directors around the country is that there's a real recognition of this deep work with a smaller group of folks to help to kind of embed knowledge about these processes in communities. And so I'd really recommend that approach in terms of trying to make this stuff more understandable. The other element of the challenge of educating the public about how, you know, permit decisions are made and how facilities get cited and renewals and all these other things, which are, you know, ultimately about regulatory and statutory processes. One of the pieces that's complicated when you're talking about exposure is that the available data that can be mapped is ultimately regulatory data, not necessarily environmental exposure or public health data. And so just flagging that once you sort of put some things on a map, it's going to be important to be able to decipher, what does that mean to me? What does that mean to my community? What does that mean for the health of my family, et cetera? Because just because there's, I don't know, some kind of brownfield plan in the works or it's been identified by the department or something like that, doesn't mean that, you know, it doesn't, first of all, doesn't mean that that site is necessarily a huge exposure pathway. And secondly, it doesn't mean that it's the only potential, you know, exposure pathway that maybe hasn't been documented. So just flagging all of those things around the need for better educating our communities about, you know, cumulative burden and pollution exposure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing some of those examples of what's happening in Newark and also other places around the country. I will also note we've been having some conversations internally about that too, as it pertains to the impact statements, but also as we were talking a couple of weeks ago about compelling public interest in the community, making sure that we're doing all that we can as a department to help our the constituents that we serve be able to effectively engage in this process. So thank you for underscoring it today. And yeah, we're going to keep working. Thank you for that feedback.
Absolutely. Yeah, capacity both at the department and across the state on environmental justice issues is critical to the success of all of the work we're doing. So got to keep pushing on it. And that's why Olivia is so great, just to be honest, and her team. And should we throw the last slide up again so folks know where to find us? Well, again, I just want to very sincerely thank everyone for all the feedback we got today. I think the rule writers were furiously taking notes to make sure that we were getting all of this together. Luckily, we have a chat transcript of some very useful ideas as well. And I'll just reiterate what I said earlier. The engagement of this group, your willingness to come to all of these meetings, to take every step of this process with us is invaluable and is going to show up in the rule in a way that we hope is very, very meaningful to all of us and put something in place that really sees through the intent of the environmental justice law and hopefully brings better times to communities that have been overlooked for far too long. So I will leave that there, and we will see you all in a month, and I'll hand it back to my colleague Olivia. And thank you again.
No, I just want to reiterate Sean's comments to just thank everyone. This has been very engaging conversation. We thank you for your thoughtfulness. We thank you for your insights. And it has truly been a pleasure to have the conversation with you this evening. And we look forward to seeing you all in several weeks once we have our button-up meetings. So please enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.